All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this interactive webinar on the ASI Standards revision. My name is Chelsea Reinhardt. I'm the Standards Director for ASI, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. So first, a reminder about the ASI antitrust policy, which is available on our website and is a condition of participation in any ASI meetings and webinars. So any discussion about pricing, price premiums, costs of certification, passing costs on to customers is not prohibited according to our policy. And there's more information available there on the website. Second, an acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and communities. So we want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to the traditional lands where we and our members operate. It's our aim to respect the cultural heritage, the customs and beliefs of all Indigenous communities, and we want to pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Today, we're on a Zoom platform. As you will have noticed, if you've made it into the call today, we will be using at the end of the call this Q&A function to capture questions. And we also have simultaneous interpretation running for the webinar in French and Mandarin. So please just take a moment and make sure that you have selected the correct language for your interpretation. And also, we are trying to make sure that we speak clearly and slow enough to allow that interpretation to happen live through the webinar. In addition to the Q&A at the end of the session, we have two interactive components. Don't worry, it's not too interactive. No need to feel uncomfortable, but we will be asking for some input from you, the audience, on some of the early thinking behind the standards revision and how some of these ideas land from your perspective, either as an ASI member, civil society representative, an industry association, etc. So when we get to those periods, we will be asking you to join menti.com, and you can do that from your phone or you can do it from a laptop, and there's a QR code there, as well as a code you can type in at menti.com. Important to note that if you are listening to the webinar in either Mandarin or French, the translations for those questions will be put into the chat in Zoom, and we'll show you how that should be quite straightforward, but there simply wasn't enough room to put all the interpretation on the slides together. And before we go further, I realize that I've introduced myself, but I haven't introduced my colleagues. So I'm joined today by Laura Brunello, Standards Coordinator, and Leah Vacheray, Standards Manager, who will be covering a few sections of the webinar as well. And we also have a number of colleagues from the broader ASI team on hand, especially to help with any questions on specific content areas or areas of expertise towards the end. All right, so we're going to start with an overview of the revision project, very brief. Most of you have probably seen a bit of background on this already. We will give you a rundown of what some of those early content and structural changes are starting to look like in the performance standard based on the working group discussions, the technical expert input, and the standards committee discussions that we've had to date. And then we'll take a pause to get some feedback from you on those performance standard related proposals. Then we'll go through an early preview of chain of custody and claims, which is another area of fairly substantial evolution in this revision project. And we'll take a minute to get some feedback from you on some of those ideas around the types of claims and information that members might find valuable with that change in chain of custody that we're looking at. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and how to get involved, and hopefully have time for questions from you at the end. So please put questions in the Q&A section, not the chat, and that will help us keep them organized and make sure we get through them. All right, so just a bit of context. If you're on the webinar today, and we assume you're familiar with ASI, we are a global multi-stakeholder standard setting and certification organization. We were founded about 10 years ago, so it's actually 10th anniversary of the organization this year. And our objective is to work across the aluminium value chain to drive sustainable sourcing and production of aluminium. And it's important to understand that objective and how it ties into ASI's theory of change. So it's not our aim to simply recognize and reward the sort of top 10% of most sustainable companies working in the aluminium supply chain. Instead, we are really working to engage at scale in the sector to drive continuous improvement and to recognize positive performance. So we believe, looking at the world today and the challenges facing the sector, that the work that's needed needs to happen at scale, and it needs to require collaboration across that value chain between suppliers and customers, between producers and brands. That includes, for example, not just creating the supply, but also the demand for low carbon aluminium. It includes things like setting industry precedents around living wages and working hours. And it also includes things like rethinking our product design and alloy specifications to enable really circular products and closed loop systems. So this is some of the thinking that's starting to emerge with the revision, and these are some of the areas that we'll be looking at later today. As a member of the ISEAL organization, a code compliant member, we review our standards at least every 5 years, and that's designed to make sure that our standards are effective and that they keep pace with changes in the industry and also changes in regulation. So we did a review of the standards and significant consultation with members last year in 2024. And in early March of this year, our multi-stakeholder standards committee made the decision to launch a full revision. So that kicked off formally in March, although quite a lot of the pre-work happened last year, and we're now in the early phases of that. So I will hand it over to Laura, who will talk a bit more about the timeline in the revision process. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Chelsea. If we can skip to the next slide. So hi everyone, I'm Laura, and I'm going to be going through the next few slides with you to look at the timeline of the revision, to talk about our multi-stakeholder process, and go through some early potential structural changes you might see in the next version of the draft. So what you can see on this slide is a timeline for the ASI Standards revision. As Chelsea mentioned, we've officially launched the revision process on the 3rd of March earlier this year. And as she also mentioned, we actually started off some pre-work late last year with what we're calling Phase 0 foundation building, which was essentially a review, taking stock of how our current standards are working by looking at assurance data, talking with members and auditors. And this resulted in a decision to undertake an official revision of the standard. Most of the work this year has been around developing the draft with input from different stakeholders and working groups. This is an iterative process that is continuing for the rest of this year, and we're anticipating to launch our first 60-day public consultation early next year, following which we will be analyzing and refining the draft based on the input received, and we'll also be holding a second round of public consultation as well later that same year, with the aim to review and finalize the draft by the end of 2026, with an anticipated official board approval in Q1 of 2027. So as you can see, there's many phases and steps ahead to ensure we really bring all stakeholder views on board and that the outcome reflects a truly multi-stakeholder process. Next slide, please. So talking about our multi-stakeholder process, ASI's approach is and always has been to engage the full aluminium value chain to move towards sustainability. In order to do that, and as I mentioned, there's lots of different stakeholder groups to bring on board. Standard setting is about bringing together hundreds, if not thousands, of individual perspectives to work out compromises in the standard. And this means not only our membership, but we're also paying specific attention to affected communities, rights holders, workers' associations, civil society, amongst others. So to briefly summarize this diagram that you can see, we have at the top our ASI Standards Committee. They are a technical multi-stakeholder oversight group for the standard and include representatives from civil society, industry, and Indigenous peoples representatives through the IPAF. We, as ASI Secretariat, we lead on the consultation, the coordination, and we support the drafting of the standards. We don't do this alone. We take in input not only from our standards committee, but also from subject matter experts, other standards and key partners through alignment and benchmarking, and also through our ASI working groups, which are composed of individuals from our membership. There's several working groups. You can see them at the bottom. There's climate change, circularity, nature, community rights and participation, workers' rights and health and safety, and chain of custody and claims. And then we have IPAF, as I mentioned, which is a very important voice as well, and it's really embedded within our standards committee, but also in our working groups as well. So lots of different stakeholders working together to reach a common objective. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go over some of the potential structural changes in this new proposed draft version of the PSV4. So on the left-hand side, it's pretty small. I hope you can see it, but you can see that the current performance standard V3 is organized into 3 pillars. So you currently have governance, environment, and social. And we're proposing a reorganization into 3 cross-cutting sections. So you can see on the right. So we'd have governance, management systems, and responsible sourcing and due diligence, as well as 5 thematic impact areas. So climate, nature, circularity, community rights, and workers' rights. So broadly reflecting the working groups. And we're also proposing next to that some modular sections for criteria that apply only in specific context or processes. So for example, mine closure and rehabilitation, which obviously would only be applicable to mines, or a specific modular section on tailings and residue management. So this is some of the early thinking that you might see reflected in the draft during the public consultation. Some of the other potential structural changes concern the format of the criteria. So in the current version of the standards, V3, you can see on the left, we have an example. We have criteria with sometimes a lot of sub-bullets under each criteria, and we're proposing to move into criterion plus requirement formats. So all it means is that what are currently the sub-bullets in V3 criteria are going to be pulled out a bit better into different requirements, as you can see on the right, the example 2.1, and be linked to a criterion which would reflect the intended outcomes of the requirements when put together. To clarify, the conformance would still be assessed at criterion level. It's just a way to better call out the different components under each criterion. So this is perhaps more of a format change. Some of the other things we're wanting to change is having greater emphasis on materiality and relevance of different criteria, depending on your supply chain activity or your risk profile, to really put effort for companies where it matters the most. So the standard may look longer than it did, but more criteria are applicable only in specific cases or contexts. We've also been incorporating some more outcomes-based criteria where relevant, as well as a new distinction between minimum requirements and leading practice requirements, which is what I'm going to be covering in the next slide. So these are some of the changes that you'll see. And as I mentioned, under each thematic area, we propose to introduce a new distinction between minimum requirements. So these would be like basic requirements that all entities must meet in order to achieve ASI certification, if it's applicable to them, of course. And then a second tier, what we'd be calling leading practice requirements, so beyond minimum. This is the first time in the evolution of the ASI standards that this level of differentiation is really moving beyond a discussion stage to actually materialize in this draft. Our aim is to do this in a way that better recognizes the diversity of the growing ASI membership and also recognize the different levels of maturity and the importance of a continuous improvement approach. For leading practice, we're proposing that these would be flexible and additive. So a company might be recognized, for example, if they meet 70% of leading requirements in a thematic area, as an example. And this recognition would be at thematic areas. So you could have leading practice in different thematic areas. So for example, bottom right, you see an entity that has achieved ASI certification and leading practice in climate, circularity, and responsible sourcing and due diligence. From an assurance perspective, entities would need to themselves opt in to be assessed as leading practice before an audit takes place. So their responsibility is to demonstrate during the audits how they fully meet these leading practices. At the same time, we are mindful of the need for simplicity in the standard, and we are looking on how to introduce different levels of differentiation without too much complexity. This is an active and open discussion, and it's ongoing with our standards committee. So we really do welcome inputs about that, and we will be asking for your feedback later on the call as well through the Menti questions. And of course, if you have anything to raise, put it in the Q&A. That's it from my side. Back to you, Chelsea.
Thank you, Laura. So as Laura's explained, already in the sort of early draft evolutions, the performance standard may look and feel a bit different. And now I'll talk to you a little bit about where some of those content changes may be as well. So going back to our diagram of the kind of revised structure in that new performance standard, just aiming to kind of heat map for you a little bit where those areas of more significant content changes are likely to be. And again, as Laura mentioned earlier, one of the key objectives for this revision from the beginning has been to increase the focus on materiality throughout the standard. So although things, requirements may grow slightly, they are growing in alignment with where those issues are most material across the value chain. So we are really trying to make sure that meeting the ASI standard for certification is not just ticking the boxes, but is actually putting effort where it matters the most, and that effort is aligned with areas of significant impact on communities, on the climate, on workers, etc. So in this structure, for example, you can see that although there are a number of changes proposed under circularity, a lot of those new additions are also focused more on areas like product design or process or product design, where those are more of a downstream focus. And in contrast, on community rights and participation, a lot of the new areas there, or the raising of ambition, is really going to be relevant mostly upstream. And similarly, in the modular sections where we're introducing some additional expectations around mine closure and rehabilitation, or tailings management and bauxite residue, again, those are applicable only in specific activities in the value chain. So we're not going to go into detail in every draft or every section, but the next two slides just give a little bit of a roll-up of where existing requirements have been strengthened or made more ambitious, where some new areas of content have been included, and where we're looking to strengthen alignment or harmonization with other frameworks as well. So where have we strengthened expectation or raised the bar? First, as I just mentioned, community impacts. So predominantly with an upstream focus. This includes ensuring that entities carry out meaningful consultation, including through free, prior, and informed consent processes where Indigenous peoples or land-connected communities are present. And that's not just consultation on paper, that's making sure that consultation is meaningful, that communities are empowered and informed to allow that consultation to be effective and to understand the issues. It also relates to a strengthening of grievance mechanisms, so not just having a process for grievance mechanisms, but making sure that that channel is well understood, that it's well trusted, and that issues that are raised through grievance mechanisms are in fact being resolved in a timely and effective way. New areas of focus there include things like community benefits and also strengthening some of the expectations around resettlement for displaced peoples. Next is around mine closure and rehabilitation. So this is an area that has very little attention in the current performance standard, but it was actually one of the top priorities coming out of consultations with the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, and is becoming increasingly relevant as we think about quite a lot of bauxite mines moving closer into closure stages in the near and midterm. So here we have more emphasis not only on that community consultation piece, as we just spoke about, but also on integrated planning for closure. And that includes financial planning and making sure that adequate resources are set aside for that planning. It also includes developing socioeconomic transition plans as well. On circularity, in the current performance standards, circularity is really nestled under a section called material stewardship, and it's nestled under the governance section. And in this new format, we've pulled that out as its own impact area, really reflecting the criticality of circularity, in particular for the aluminium sector and its evolution in the future. So we have more emphasis on product and process design, really thinking about how those kinds of downstream or midstream expectations and design specifications go hand in hand with building circularity in from the ground up and thinking about what's possible for recycling and product recapture. More emphasis on valorization of resource flows, including scrap, and also more inclusion of material flows as a concept, and that aligns with the input, process, output models. So we've had a lot of active discussions. We just had a meeting in the circularity working group yesterday with a lot of good input there, and I think you will see some fairly meaningful changes come out of that section. Next, we have elaborated further some of the responsible sourcing and due diligence requirements that are already baked in fundamentally into version 3. So there's not a real raising of the bar necessarily, but there is more expansion and clearer alignment around the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines as fundamental instruments there. And last, one of the areas where we do have some more substantial changes within workers' rights is this component around working hours and wages, where for the first time we'll be exploring proposals around payment of fair wages to direct employees, as opposed to just a minimum wage expectation, and also looking at adjusting some of the calculations in the current standard around working hours, which have been a bit problematic to implement, and also thinking about setting, at least at leading practice level, some new expectations for maximum hours, including overtime. And those are difficult to do because of the different variety of contexts that ASI members and entities operate in, and different local regulation and different working cultures, but still that's an area that we're exploring actively. In addition, we have some new content that's coming in. So under the climate section, you'll see a first-time inclusion of adaptation. And right now, that's a fairly high-level approach, thinking about climate risk management. But still, that's an area that probably many companies are already looking at. And it's definitely, as we make perhaps more limited progress on the emissions abatement, of course, that adaptation piece also becomes more important. More inclusion of recycling of water, so going beyond kind of minimum standard practice and really thinking about longer term, more strategic recycling strategies. In workers' rights, we are looking at moving beyond the kind of very generic occupational health and safety management system focus, although that remains fundamental, but also thinking about how, as a sector-specific standard, we could be a little bit more specific about some of the common issues and risks throughout the aluminium value chain. So for example, things like ergonomic risks and impacts, or noise issues and impacts. And as well, we are looking at expanding the health and safety focus to focus a bit more on health, as well as that safety component, which is already quite strong in the standard. At leading practice level, we have some more inclusions around diversity and inclusion. So thinking about actually going beyond non-discrimination towards more active support for and transparency around diversity of workforce and inclusion. And as you saw in the diagram around the structure, we now have a modular section proposed, which covers bauxite residue management, but also tailings management. And there we are looking at how we can better harmonize with the global industry standard on tailings management, and think about how we can complement some of the areas that are already covered in that standard. And last, we are looking at strengthening some of the due diligence support we can give through the standard, and including a more explicit requirement for companies to be passing origin information through the chain to customers upon request. And that's already covered a little bit in our current due diligence sections, although not very explicit now. On climate, so unfortunately, my colleague Chris Bayless isn't here today on the webinar, but for those of you who've been participating in the climate working group or discussions, this will look quite familiar. So as many of you may know, ASI's current standard has a core requirement to set targets in line with a 1.5 degree aligned pathway that was developed together with data from the IAI around sector-specific approach for aluminium. And right now, our standard requires companies to not only set targets and map their pathway along that sector-specific 1.5 degree aligned pathway, but also to demonstrate progress and emissions reductions along that curve. And earlier this year, we introduced an exemptions process that basically recognized some of the structural challenges that many companies face in being able to reduce emissions in line with that pathway in the short term. So one of the objectives of this revision is to make sure that that exemptions process, which allows companies to basically remain certified with open nonconformities against that 5.3 criterion in our current standard, would be replaced by a more fit for purpose and flexible approach to emissions reduction in the new standard. So we don't want to be inheriting that exemption process as we go into the revised standard. But what are we looking at instead? This is a difficult and complicated area of discussion, but we've had a lot of good inputs from the working group so far. So the current proposals, and again, these are working draft proposals subject to change, would be looking at potentially having some differentiated minimum expectations on emissions reduction for upstream entities, which focuses mostly on abatement. For midstream, which is a combination of procurement of low carbon aluminium and recycled content, and then shifting some of the downstream perspective to really focus on procurement, because that is where a lot of their leverage exists. We would also be looking at having some differentiated short-term minimum expectations for how much reduction is possible for lower and higher emitting upstream activities. And that's really recognizing that when you look at that sectoral curve for 1.5 degree alignment, a lot of the heavy lifting in emissions reduction in the short term is driven by those high emitters starting to come down on the curve. And for those who are starting already at a lower starting point on that curve, a lot of what's needed in the short or midterm is actually investment in some of the technology that will unlock that hard to abate emissions in the longer term. And that's the bullet point that you see a little bit later, is starting to call out that kind of recognition of investment and action now in enabling some of that technology, which could then scale to help us with that hard to abate part of the emissions in the longer term. It is important to mention that the ambition for 1.5 degree alignment and the targets being set around that still would remain in the current proposal. So although we're recognizing the challenges in making progress along that pathway, we're not yet moving away from a 1.5 degree ambition or target alignment. In addition, we've had a number of conversations about the possibility to better recognize Science-Based Targets Initiative or SBTI targets, especially for perhaps the downstream members in the supply chain, where they are multi-material types of entities and may already be setting SBTI targets. And last, we are exploring potentially whether with this now ability to differentiate between minimum and leading practice, whether it requires also revisiting the current smelter threshold, which is in the current performance standard as criterion 5.2. So that's a very early discussion that we're having with the input from the working groups. And last, before we move on to getting some feedback from your side, just a quick note on alignment with other standards and frameworks. So throughout the revised standard, we are trying to really promote more harmonization with other standards and frameworks. This is always a key ask from our members. So we're looking at how we can do that more going forward. And just a note to say that where we have existing alignment around our LME responsible sourcing, track A, around the recognition of ISO standards, that those would remain. So we're not looking at shifting that existing alignment we have. All right, so that was quite a high-level whistle-stop tour of some of the structural and proposed content changes in those early drafts of the revised standard. And now it's over to you, the audience, to give us some input. How does that sound from your perspective? Are we roughly on the right track? Are there things that we've missed? Are there areas you'd like to see the level of ambition look different? So I'm going to ask you now to go into the Mentimeter, and I will maybe see whether somebody can just drop into the chat as well, that QR code. But you can go into menti.com and you can use this code at the top of your screen, which I can't see. It's blocked on my window, but you should be able to see it. And just give us a sense of where you are, which part of the aluminium value chain or ecosystem are you joining us from today? It's all anonymous. Nothing's coming back to you directly, but we'll give you a few minutes for each of these questions. I know we have more of you on the line than this. And again, if you are listening in Mandarin or French, the translations are in the chat so that you can still participate. All right. So fairly even split. I know we've still got only a minority of participants on the Mentimeter, so we'll give you a few minutes as we carry on. All right, so good representation from midstream. Few civil society members joining, that's good. All right, the next question is just trying to get a sense from you about where the focus should be. I've given you our overview of where we're expecting at this point some of the more significant content changes may be. And now I want to hear from you. So compared to the current version of the performance standard, where should the revised standards be either more or less ambitious? And by ambitious, we mean where is the minimum expectation going up for performance? Or if you think the current expectation needs to get harder in order to maintain our credibility and drive positive impacts, you put your slider to the right there. If you think things should be a bit less ambitious, maybe open up accessibility of the standard, make it easier for companies, you would go more to the left there. Interesting, all right. So you can see here that you get not only an average score, but you also can see in that kind of what looks like a mountain landscape curve where that distribution is. So on circularity, for example, your distribution looks fairly equal. Most people are saying we should improve a bit. But interesting here on community impacts, there's quite a divide between those that think we really should strengthen up that section and those who think actually we should keep it about the same. And even those who think maybe it should get a bit less rigorous. All right. This is an open text question. So out of those structural or content changes that we've shared, which one do you support the most? Which one are you most excited about? You can put in a word or a couple words. Circularity, a couple of votes for circularity. Yeah, my colleague Gabriel will be pleased. Yeah. Oh, great. I think he's planted some people in the audience here. That's great. So interesting, we have inclusion of outcome-based criteria, and that's an interesting one that we didn't talk about too much. So the Standards Committee has really outlined this as one of the objectives for the revision from the beginning to try and complement our existing management system and process focus with trying to build into that standard more impact-driven or outcome-based, quantifiable in some cases, requirements. And that's trying to make sure that we are in fact driving positive outcomes and that that standard remains credible and impact focused, not only papers, document focused. In practice, we found these are hard to do, and we've had a lot of controversy and discussion within the working groups about whether or not those outcome-based criteria are good metrics, whether they're measuring the right things, whether they're applicable in all cases, et cetera. So definitely that will be a focus point for upcoming consultation periods. All right, some good leading practices, circularity, a living wage for workers, great. GHG reduction expectations. All right, next one. Actually, some of you have already answered this, but just to take a moment on this distinction between leading practice differentiation and claims. Is that something you think would be valuable from your organization's perspective? All right, so fairly even split between those who are cautiously interested, want to learn a bit more, and those who think, yes, looks promising, in the right track. I would say, as Laura mentioned, there's a lot of work still to come in terms of working out the details and also thinking about the implementation and assurance side here. And my colleague Cam and his team on the assurance side are going to be very involved in that process as well. All right, last question related to, I think, the performance standard is how interested would you be in the following claims that you might be able to make in the future? So as Laura mentioned, and we have that little diagram, is it of interest to be able to differentiate by thematic area? And this is recognizing that each company has slightly different strengths. So you may be very strong in one area of sustainability and perhaps still working in other areas. Would you find more value, either from your perspective or from customer perspectives, to have that kind of differentiation rolled up at the certification level? So a kind of level A, maybe if you meet a certain performance level. And if you have an explanation for those or some reasons behind it, save it, because the next question, I think the last one here, will be an open text and you can explain there. And the third point C is asking really, do you have interest in making more performance related claims? So one example is around the kind of reduction of GHG emissions or demonstrating that performance in line with a 1.5 degree reduction pathway. So those are things that actually many companies are already doing. They're already getting checked during ASI audits, and those would be things we could actually support more claims around. All right, we'll give that one just another minute, and then I think in the interest of time, we'll move on. All right, so this is the last open text question, and this one will stay open, I think, while we move on to the rest of the presentation. So feel free to take a few minutes. Based on what you've heard today, what other comments or questions or feedback do you have for us at this point? Again, this is an early sort of look at what's under the hood. So there's lots of time still to incorporate feedback from our membership into this evolution. This is the time to get your input in. All right, I'm going to carry on, but if you are in great, you're writing some comments, you'll have a few minutes to be able to do that through the Menti. So comment about encouraging recycling of pre-consumer scrap, traceable origins, yep. Auditable language, that's a good one. So we have just commissioned our first set of auditability reviews, even on this early draft, and we expect to be doing that again at least once or twice through the evolution. More performance or outcome-based indicators, yes, that's the dream. We are working on it, but it will involve compromises that we will need to see a little bit more flexibility, that those may not be perfect or they may not be fit for all cases. Contractors, employees' rights and needs. Yeah, this is really important and something we've been discussing in the workers' rights section, that actually a lot of that risk is not necessarily with direct employees, but with contractors who are doing a fair amount actually of the work and are typically not as tightly controlled or subject to the same support mechanisms. So really good point here. Yes, ISO 50001, that has come up before. So this is something we will look at again. Detailed rating guidance for each criteria. I think this refers to the kind of conformance guidance that we have developed for the GHG related criterion. This is great. Mapping facilities to improve environmental health and safety, okay. Orientation towards existing standards, great. Lots of good comments coming through here. All right, alignment of FPIC requirements. All right. Value chain support for measurement of circularity metrics, okay. All right, and here's a comment about the differentiation, which is really trying to make sure that that minimum expectation is still set at a level that ensures a certain level of sustainability. Yeah, this is definitely very relevant in the discussions that we're having at the moment. All right, keep them coming. We will go through all these comments and make sure they're passed over to the right thematic leads and working group discussions. And now I'm going to move on to the chain of custody and claims section. So we'll leave the performance standard for a minute and move into chain of custody. So what's next for chain of custody? What's next? That's the big question at stake. ASI, as many of you know, has an existing group mass balance chain of custody. Originally, one of the main objectives of that standard was actually designed to support uptake of the performance standard across the sector. So unique compared to many voluntary standard systems is ASI's focus in that that performance standard is not just at production level, at the bauxite mine or the refinery, but actually relevant throughout the value chain. That is different compared to many other iSteel members or eco-label standard systems. That does mean that the value proposition for chain of custody certification alone, in some cases, isn't as clearly understood. And although we don't see a lot of on-product labeling or a lot of kind of use of logo around ASI Aluminium at the downstream side of the chain, those members who are using it, who are mostly around food and beverage and packaging, are quite committed to continuing their use of that logo. So some of the questions, the strategic questions that we've been exploring with the working group here and with the standards committee is, given where we are in evolution of ASI and growth in our membership, evolution in claims regulation, due diligence regulation, what do we do with the chain of custody? To what degree should we be changing or evolving that system to both reduce the burden and the effort of implementation and or to derive more value for ASI members? So when we carried out quite a lot of consultation over 2024 and early part of this year, we heard things from the upstream and midstream. We don't see a lot of demand for ASI material. There's a lot of work actually, even in the group mass balance, the material accounting system. And we see our chain of custody audit costs going up. And downstream, we heard things like, actually, there isn't a lot of use of the logo or claims, depending on the downstream sector. Maybe mass balance is not meeting all of the kind of demands around transparency or traceability. And really what they wanted to see was better support for supply chain mapping and better support for due diligence. And that wasn't necessarily at a batch traceability level, but more about being able to understand where their material came from, what's the region of origin, and what are the risks and the mitigation strategies around those production regions of origin. So since then, we've outlined sort of 4 major areas of work that relate to the chain of custody and claims. And here we are really trying to start with the end in mind, which is, the chain of custody itself is a system to deliver value, either through the claims it enables, the information flow it enables through the chain, or certain risks or controls that it puts in place across the value chain. So rather than thinking what needs to happen to the chain of custody model, we are trying to think about what is the end result that we and our members want to see. And from that point, what types of chain of custody systems or material accounting systems might support those end results. So on the area 1, this is really evolving our current mass balance system. And here we are looking at, what could we do to streamline the existing chain of custody while still allowing the same types of claims so that those don't go away from the members who are finding value in those claims already. Area 2 is the thinking about more performance-related claims. So as we just discussed, related to the performance standard, especially as we explore more outcome-based criteria, there may be an opportunity to deepen some of the claims that companies could make, also with a differentiation component coming in. And again, these are things that are relatively low-hanging fruit because they're already in the standard, or they will be, and they're already being checked and audited. The third area is thinking about how that existing chain of custody system or its future versions might better support our members in their supply chain mapping and due diligence. So as I mentioned earlier, one area here is about making it more explicit that that certified supply chain is passing information on region of origin down the chain. And that's not at batch level, so that's not a batch traceability requirement, but that's about a sourcing origin type of requirement. And we're also under there thinking about longer term, what types of supply chain mapping or analytical tools could ASI support and offer to members. And the fourth area is really thinking about whether or not there's an opportunity for ASI to do more around environmental quality claims at the product level. And those would be things like a verified product carbon footprint or longer term thinking about a recycled content type of claim. More complicated, would take more time and investment to do, but potentially of interest to members. So progress so far on these, certainly in the short term, as I mentioned already, we are making some minor changes around due diligence support and longer term thinking about some of that supply chain mapping or analytics. So we have quite a lot of data certainly already existing in the aluminium sector and also from third parties around the movement of aluminium and around the sourcing region could be better utilized or analyzed. On the that area 1 from the previous slide, which is sort of what happens to our current chain of custody offering, we have drafted a streamlined version of that mass balance chain of custody, which really tries to strip that back to its basic material accounting components. So ASI Aluminium in, recording of volumes in, identification, ASI material out, recording of volumes, and take out some of the areas of fluff or areas that are already duplicated within the performance standard. And more work is needed to think about how that then could be reducing the effort or implementation burden. So could that then strip down group mass balance chain of custody be something where it's a remote audit process, where it's simply tacked on as a sub-module with your performance standard certification. So rather than it feeling like a separate onerous chain of custody certification, really what is it that we need to be verifying at those audits, and how do we make that as light touch as possible, without, of course, compromising any credibility. And then we have also been discussing with the working group some of the considerations on alternate chain of custody models, which includes thinking about a kind of optional tier for site level mass balance. So is that of value to members if we have a more formalized level of chain of custody, which means implementing mass balance only at a specific site level? And also looking at some of the considerations around longer term moving towards more of a physical segregation or an identity preservation, which is a kind of traceability chain of custody model that would allow traceability back to region or mine of origin. And in those cases, we've had some discussions across the value chain over the competing interests from downstream to have more transparency and some of the process-related challenges, especially with continuous processes at smelter level that make that segregation very, very difficult, at least at scale in the sector. And finally, on the allocated environmental claims, we have been exploring, and many of you have probably had a conversation with Chris Bayless on this over the last few months, the appetite and the interest in ASI doing some further work on product carbon footprint related claims. So far, it looks like there's a lot of complexity and fairly mixed demand for ASI to develop a verified sort of product carbon footprint claim offering. So in the shorter term, some of the focus will look at whether or not there's role for ASI to play in developing product category rules that could enable comparable claims, for example, around environmental product declarations or EPDs, as an additional value add to members. And that would promote consistent comparability of the product claims that are already out there. So I think that's my rundown. And now we have just a few final questions related to some of that chain of custody and claims pieces. So this is a good opportunity for us to get a further steer from members and other stakeholders on where you might see value in some of these different claims or information flow offerings. So this question, if you guys will give you a minute or two to shift back to Mentimeter, is how valuable would your organization find the following claims or information? So the first is really the continuation of what we have already, your ability to buy ASI Aluminium, COC material, as we call it today. B is asking about your ability to sell or label products, so thinking from what customers might find valuable as ASI Aluminium. C is asking about this level of value you would get for your suppliers to be sharing origin information. And we know this is not already happening in the system because companies have told us it's not always happening today. D is thinking about going beyond that to create more sort of mid-longer term supply chain mapping offerings. E is about thinking about value of verified product carbon footprints with ASI approved rules. So, and F finally is about being able to share information more on how companies or even sites are performing against the ASI standards and where their ESG impacts might be. And this might be of interest, for example, if you're a civil society member or an industry association, that point F. We'll give it just a few more minutes while things are moving around. So it looks at the moment like this point C around the sharing of origin information through the chain is definitely a front runner. All right. Question 8 here is, we're nearly at the end. I think it's this and one more, is about what other product-related claims or information would you find valuable that relate to your aluminium sourcing or sustainability or certification? Are there other areas that we should be exploring? Okay, so if someone's alignment with CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, responsible recycled content, yes, not surprised to see that cropping up. Requires some tricky discussions and positions on allocation, but yes, responsible sourcing, okay. Interesting. Claims or information around FPIC being obtained for operations on Indigenous land, okay. All right, claims on OECD alignment, life cycle impacts, pre-consumer, post-consumer recycling. Okay, clarity there. All right, we'll give that another minute or two. Okay, LCA metrics, recycled material. All right, and then the final question that we've got is, so taking a step back from specific claims categories and thinking back to what we presented earlier on the performance standard and also on the chain of custody, if you had to boil it up to kind of one single thing that you think is most important for ASI to get right with this revision, so chain of custody or performance standard related, what would it be? What would you ask us to make sure we do right? And that's a free text question for you. Okay. Give it a few minutes. It's not an easy one to answer quickly. All right, so we've got a vote for alignment with other ESG frameworks like the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative, CMSI. Vote for product category rules for product carbon footprint, life cycle assessment, GHG emissions. Auditability, improving auditability. This is a very good one. I believe in this one a lot, making sure audit results reflect the reality of the ground in terms of community rights, workers' rights, and environmental impacts. Absolutely. Yep, going beyond documents and management systems. And that will require changes not only in the standard, which we've been talking about today, but also our assurance team and process will be working on a parallel review and updating of the assurance system. And some of those are likely to have changes on the audit process, auditor competencies, etc. Support members in developing the incentives for chain of custody compliance, better guidance for auditors, integration with other standards, absolutely. Alignment of structure, the ISO norm system, yeah, this is a useful point to take on board. Improve Elemental. Elemental is in the process of a multi-year. It is quite a lengthy process, but apparently it is getting an overhaul and expect that to be completed, I believe, sort of end of this year, very early next year, with quite a lot of improved functionality. This is a good point that we didn't talk about on the call today, but this is about including non-ASI material in product claims, similar to FSC controlled wood. This is an area we've been discussing with the chain of custody group, I believe, about what types of controls going beyond the existing kind of basic due diligence we already require on non-ASI sort of eligible scrap, but thinking about how that might also be expanded or strengthened to non-ASI material. A very good point coming in there as well. Credibility of anti-greenwashing and claims, credibility in the high bar, alignment with IAI. I assume that means around GHG footprinting, maybe there's something else. Use of digital technologies and audits, so quite a few comments as well about audit process. These are really helpful. Here's a multifold suggestion: improving standard without creating a higher burden for companies while harmonizing with other regulations. There's a few you've nested together there, but all valid. All right, that's the end of our second Mentimeter feedback. I think this one will stay open for a bit. You can continue to add your comments. This is really helpful. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Leah, just to talk to you about what's coming next in the revision and opportunities for you to get involved. Leah, are you able?
Hello.
Are you unmuted? Hi, go ahead.
Hi. So, hello everyone, my name is Leah Vacheray, I'm the Standards Manager, and as Chelsea said, I'm here to talk about next steps and how you can get involved. Everything, all the information that we have on the Standards Revision is available to you on the ASI Standards Revision Hub. So if you do a Google search, ASI Standards Revision Hub, you'll find this page where we have an interactive timeline. So if you click into the dates and the major things that are happening, you'll be able to get more information about those things. We also publish a digest periodically with updates and milestones and dates for you to remember and get involved in. And you can sign up for our regular updates, which will land directly in your inbox. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of immediate next steps, we talked about being in this early pre-consultation periods on the draft as it currently stands. So we'll be doing that through July and August. We have a bunch of technical experts who are feeding into what we currently have in the draft. We're doing some feasibility assessments with some sample of certified entities and some Chinese members. We're doing auditability reviews with ASI approved auditors. We're also doing some focus groups with the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. So all of that will happen over the rest of July and through into August. And in September, we'll be looking to put all of that input back together into the drafts, back into the working groups and the standards committee, who will be turning it all over and redrafting and creating a new iteration the requirements for September. And I think we'll be looking to really highlight any areas of priority where further work is needed, as well as any red flags that have been highlighted. And then in October and December, it will be continued meetings of working groups and standards committee, at the end of which there'll be public consultation in Q1 of 2026. At least that is the plan at the moment. So look out for updates on that through the Standards Revision Hub, which I mentioned before.
Thank you, Leah. So that brings us to the end of our regularly scheduled programming. And now it's a time, we've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So I'm going to divert you back into the Q&A function through Mentimeter, through Zoom. Too many windows open. And you can go ahead and add a question in. I can see some questions have already been answered, but we have a few in already. So take a few minutes if you've got a question. There's one here already about what do you see as the incentive to pursue leading practice requirements? And will product claims be tied to this, for example? So the current thinking is that those would be at the entity or company level. So they'd be tied to your certification, not to a specific product claim. And really, in terms of what's the incentive, some of that we're interested in hearing from you on. So is there incentive? Is there value in being able to differentiate? So the original concept of having that distinction was both to recognize companies who are at different levels of maturity, but also to think about making sure that there is a continuous improvement sort of pathway being built into that standard. So you can think about some of the things that might come in as leading practice in 2027, in 5 years down the road from that, or 6 years, when the next revision comes out, those might become mainstreamed as minimum expectations as companies evolve and regulation evolves as well. But some of this really in terms of thinking about how interested are you in that differentiation, we are very much in a listening mode. We also have a question about how to get involved in working groups. So most of those working groups have been up and running now since end of March or early April. If you are interested in getting involved, send an email either to one of us on the standards team, or we have a general consultation at ASI or aluminiumstewardship.org, which we can pop in the chat. That's also available on that revision hub. And that comes directly to our team. We take feedback, we take input, we take questions, and we will have a check and see whether or not there are spaces in those working groups to enable additional participants. So we have capped those to ensure that they remain kind of interactive and people have time to be able to participate and get their voice in, but not all of them, I think, are operating already at capacity.
Yeah, actually the nature working group, workers' rights and community rights all have some limited spots available. So you can message us if you're interested in those.
Any other questions coming through? We had a question about transition period. So when would these changes come into apply? That still hasn't been determined yet. So we do expect that there will be a transition period. Will it be as long as the transition period for version 3? I don't know yet. The aim is to try and balance kind of moving that membership over to a new standard in a fairly efficient timeline, but while recognizing that companies might have just been certified against the current version before the new version goes live, and also thinking about the effort and cost onto members to migrate. So it's always a balancing act, but still to be determined. All right, if there are no other questions, then I think we will go ahead and wrap up for today. So thank you all very much for giving us your time and input. Stay tuned. There's lots more change and evolution to come, but we really remain open and appreciative of your feedback. So thanks very much for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your morning or afternoon or evening.